The wind did not blow in the Wyoming territory so much as it scoured. It was a physical weight, a living thing with teeth that chewed at the mortar between the logs of the cabin and stripped the moisture from the very air. On this Tuesday in late November of 1878, the sky was a bruised shade of violet and slate, pressing down low over the high plains. There was no sun, only a diffuse, sickly light that cast no shadows and offered no warmth. Eliza Hart stood by the well, her knuckles white where she gripped the handle of the galvanized bucket. The pump mechanism was frozen again. It had taken her 20 minutes of pouring boiling water over the iron casing to coax it into movement, and now the water that spilled out was thick with ice crystals, shocking her skin with a bite that felt like fire. She was 24 years old, though the mirror she kept hidden in her trunk told the story of a woman 10 years older. Her skin, once the color of cream and roses back in Ohio, was windburned and chapped, and fine lines had begun to etch themselves around eyes that were always scanning the horizon for trouble. She lifted the bucket, the water sloshing against the metal sides, and turned toward the cabin. It was a squat, miserable structure, hastily thrown together from cottonwood logs that had warped in the summer heat and shrunk in the winter freeze. The wind whistled through the gaps she had tried to stuff with rags and mud. It sat alone on a rise of ground that offered no shelter, exposed to the sweep of the wind coming down from the Bighorn Mountains. Eliza walked with a measured, careful gait. The ground was treacherous, a chaotic topography of frozen mud ruts and patches of old, crusted snow that had turned as hard as stone. Under her wool dress and the heavy coat that was 3 sizes too big, her ribs ached. There was a bruise blooming on her left side, a mottled purple mark the size of a man's fist, a souvenir from 3 days ago when the biscuits had been too hard for Charles's liking. She did not touch the spot. She had learned long ago that acknowledging the pain only gave it power, and she needed all her strength just to put one foot in front of the other. Inside the cabin, the air was smoky and smelled of grease and stale tobacco. A single coal oil lamp burned on the table, its wick trimmed low to save fuel. Eliza set the bucket down and exhaled, seeing her breath hang in the damp air. She moved automatically, her mind retreating into that quiet, gray place she had built for herself. It was a fortress of numbness, a way to survive the shouting and the silence, the sudden explosions of violence and the long, grinding periods of resentment. But beneath the numbness, there was something else, a small, hard kernel of something that felt like hope, or perhaps just stubbornness. She checked the wood box. It was nearly empty. She would have to go back out. Charles was not there. He had ridden out early, hungover and surly, to check on the few head of scrawny cattle that constituted their entire livelihood. He had been a different man in Cincinnati. He had been Charles Galloway Hart, a merchant with grand ideas and a charming smile, wearing silk waistcoats and speaking of the boundless opportunities of the West. He had courted her with poetry and promises, but the West had a way of stripping the veneer off a man, revealing exactly what kind of wood lay underneath. Charles was softwood, prone to rot. He had failed at shopkeeping in Cheyenne, failed at prospecting in the Black Hills, and now he was failing at ranching on this godforsaken patch of scrubland. And he hated her for it. He hated her because she did not break. He hated her because when the money ran out, she took in washing from the bachelor miners 20 miles away. He hated her because she knew how to stretch a sack of flour for 3 months. Every time she solved a problem he had created, it was a reminder of his own inadequacy, and he punished her for it with his silence, and then with his words, and finally, with his hands. Eliza pulled her shawl tighter and went back out to the woodpile. The wind had changed. It had stopped coming in gusts and was now a steady, high-pitched scream that vibrated in her teeth. She looked to the northwest. The mountains were gone. In their place was a towering wall of white, a solid mass that seemed to connect the earth to the sky. It did not look like weather. It looked like the end of the world. She remembered the words of Old Man Miller, a trapper she had spoken to outside the dry goods store in town 2 weeks ago. He had looked at the sky with watery, pale eyes and spat tobacco juice into the dirt. The winter of big sleeps is coming. Mrs., he had said, you get your man to batten down. This one will freeze the breath in your lungs before you can blow it out, Eliza had told Charles. Charles had laughed, a sharp, barking sound devoid of humor. He called Miller a senile fool and spent the money intended for new chinking on a bottle of whiskey and a deck of cards. Eliza did not laugh. She grabbed armfuls of split wood. Ignoring the splinters tearing at her gloves, she ran back and forth from the pile to the cabin, stacking the logs high against the interior wall. She worked with a frantic energy, her heart hammering against her ribs. The temperature was dropping. She could feel it on her skin. A sudden, plunging cold that made the moisture in her nose freeze instantly. She was just dropping the last armful of wood when the door banged open. Charles stood there, framed against the gray light. He was a tall man who had grown heavy with drink, his face flushed and puffy, his eyes watery and red-rimmed. He looked at the pile of wood, then at Eliza. "What is this?" he asked. His voice was thick, the slur of whiskey evident even at 2 in the afternoon. Eliza brushed the bark dust from her apron. "A storm is coming, Charles? Look at the sky." He kicked the door shut behind him, cutting off the wind. "You are always frightening yourself with shadows. Eliza, it is just a snow squall." "It is not a squall," she said, keeping her voice low and even. "The ranchers in town said this winter would be hard. I am just getting ready." "Getting ready," he mocked, moving toward the table where a half-empty bottle sat. "You act as if we are under siege. You act as if I cannot take care of this place." She did not answer. She moved to the cupboard, opening the door to check the supplies. She had hidden a small sack of flour and a bottle of laudanum behind the tin of lard. She had saved 50 cents here, $1 there, stealing from the money he left on the dresser when he passed out, or selling a few eggs to a passing rider. It was her secret insurance, a buffer against his incompetence. Charles sat heavily in the chair, watching her. His mood was dark, a brooding thunderhead that matched the sky outside. He had lost again at the poker table in town yesterday. She knew it by the way he held his shoulders, the way he refused to meet her eyes until he wanted to hurt her. "Make me some coffee," he ordered. "We are low on coffee. Charles, we should save it. Make the coffee," he roared, slamming his hand down on the table. Eliza flinched, the motion involuntary. She moved to the stove, reaching for the coffee grinder. As she did, the hem of her skirt caught on the edge of the lower cupboard door, pulling it open. The small sack of flour she had hidden, wrapped in brown paper, tumbled out and rolled across the floor, coming to rest against Charles's boot. The silence in the room was absolute. The wind howled outside, scratching at the door like a desperate animal. But inside, the air was still and heavy with threat. Charles looked down at the sack. He reached down slowly and picked it up. He squeezed it, feeling the texture. Then he looked at Eliza. His eyes were cold, terrifyingly sober for a moment. "Where did you get this?" he asked. Eliza gripped the handle of the coffee grinder. "I bought it." "With what money?" he asked, his voice dropping to a whisper that was more frightening than his shout. "I told you we were broke. I told you I lost the cattle money. Where did you get the money?" "Eliza, I saved it," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "From the household money. From the eggs." "You stole it," he said. He stood up, the chair scraping loud against the floorboards. "You stole from me. You think I am a fool. You think I am too weak to provide for my own house, so you have to hoard like a rat. I was trying to make sure we didn't starve." She cried out, the frustration of 3 years breaking through her caution. "You drink the money, Charles. You gamble it away on pairs of 2s and 3s. Someone has to think about tomorrow because you never think past the bottom of the bottle." The back of his hand struck her before she saw him move. It was a heavy, jarring blow that knocked her sideways. She caught herself against the rough log wall, tasting blood where her tooth cut the inside of her lip. The room spun. Charles stood over her, breathing hard. The flour sack was clutched in his left hand. He looked at it, then threw it violently across the room. It burst against the stone fireplace. a cloud of white dust exploding into the air, coating the floor and the hearth in a ghost-like layer of wasted food. "You ungrateful shrew," he spat. "I dragged you out of that suffocating life in Ohio. I gave you a future. And this is how you repay me? By hiding money? By looking at me with those judging eyes?" He turned away, pacing the small room like a caged animal. The wind outside had risen to a deafening roar. The cabin groaned under the assault. "I'm going to town," he announced suddenly. Eliza pushed herself up from the wall, panic piercing through the haze of pain in her head. "Charles, you cannot— Look outside. The storm is here. I have business to attend to," he said, grabbing his heavy buffalo coat from the peg. "I have debts to settle. I will not stay here and be looked at by a thief." "You will die out there," Eliza screamed, rushing toward him. "It is a whiteout. Charles, you will never make it to the road, let alone the town." He shoved her back. "Do not tell me what I can do. I am not a child." He threw the door open. The violence of the storm rushed in instantly. A blast of snow, hard as sand, scoured the room. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a second. Beyond the doorframe, the world had vanished. There was no sky, no ground, only a swirling, screaming void of white. "See!" Charles yelled over the wind, struggling to button his coat. "It is just snow." He stepped out onto the porch. Eliza ran after him, grabbing his arm. Her fingers clawed at the rough wool of his sleeve. "Charles, please! Wait until it passes. We have wood. We have a little meat. Just stay. Do not leave me here alone." It was the wrong thing to say. It exposed her vulnerability, her dependence on him, and in his twisted state of mind, that gave him the upper hand he had been losing. He stopped and looked down at her. The snow was already matting in his beard, turning him into a stranger. "Alone?" he said, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "You are so capable. Eliza, you save money. You buy flour. You think you are better than me. Let us see how you manage when you are truly master of the house." He pulled his arm free, but she lunged again, terrified by the wall of white behind him. "Charles!" He turned on her, his face contorted with a sudden, blind rage. He grabbed her by the shoulders. "You want to be out in it so bad? Then go!" He dragged her off the porch. Eliza screamed, her boots skidding on the ice-slicked wood. He threw her bodily into the snow. She landed hard on her hands and knees, the frozen crust tearing at her palms. The cold was instantaneous, a shock that stopped her heart. The wind hit her like a hammer, stealing the air from her lungs. She scrambled to turn around, to crawl back to the door, but Charles was already there. He looked at her, a dark shape in the swirling whiteness. "Find your own way." "Eliza!" he shouted. "If you are so clever, find your own way." He turned and strode toward the barn where the horses were kept. He did not look back. He did not see her try to stand, did not see the wind knock her down again. He swung onto his horse, kicked the beast into a panic, and disappeared into the white curtain. "Charles!" Eliza screamed. The name was torn from her lips and shredded by the wind before it traveled 3 feet. She was 10 yards from the cabin. It might as well have been 10 miles. She pushed herself up, staggering. The snow was driving horizontally, stinging her eyes, blinding her. She turned toward where she thought the door was. She took a step, then another. She reached out, expecting to feel the rough wood of the porch railing. Her hand met only air. She stumbled forward. Panic, cold and sharp, rose in her throat. She had turned around when she fell. Which way was the cabin? She spun in a circle, but there were no landmarks. The world had been erased. There was no horizon, no ground, no sky. There was only the white, howling nothingness. "Please," she whispered. She took 3 steps to the left. Nothing. She turned back to the right, moving faster now, desperation making her clumsy. She tripped over a buried sagebrush and fell face first into a drift. The snow packed into her collar, melting against her neck and sending rivulets of ice water down her spine. She scrambled up. The cold was already seeping through her dress, gnawing at her bones. Her fingers were stiffening. "Charles!" she screamed again, though she knew he was gone. She was screaming for the idea of him, for the husband who had once brought her flowers, for anyone. She walked blindly. She had to find the wall. If she could just find the wall, she could feel her way to the door. She kept her hands stretched out in front of her like a sleepwalker. She walked for what felt like minutes, but must have been only seconds, or perhaps hours. Time had no meaning in the whiteout. Her foot caught on a patch of ice, and she went down hard, twisting her ankle. Pain shot up her leg, hot and sickening. She gasped, inhaling a lungful of snow. She lay there for a moment, the wind piling a drift against her side. It would be so easy to stay. The thought came to her with seductive clarity. Just close your eyes. The noise will stop. The pain will stop. No. The voice in her head sounded like her mother's. Not the harsh, judgmental mother of her later years, but the mother who had nursed her through scarlet fever. Get up, Eliza! She forced herself to her knees. She crawled. She did not know what direction she was going. She was moving away from the wind, letting it push her. Was that toward the barn, toward the creek, toward the endless, empty prairie? She remembered her father's face when she told him she was marrying Charles. He had not shouted. He had simply looked at her with a profound sadness. He is a hollow man. Eliza, he will break when the weight of the world is put on him, and he will let the pieces fall on you. You were right, Papa, she thought, the tears freezing on her cheeks. You were right. Her strength was failing. The cold was no longer painful. It was becoming a heaviness, a leaden weight in her limbs. Her thoughts began to fragment. She saw the parlor in Cincinnati. She smelled lilacs. She saw Charles smiling, holding out a hand that held a knife. She stumbled again, and this time she could not get up. She had walked into a depression in the ground, a shallow ravine that was rapidly filling with snow. She curled into a ball, trying to preserve the last heat of her core. The snow was heavy on her back. It felt like a blanket, a thick, heavy, white blanket. She tried to pray, Our Father, who art in heaven. The words tangled in her mind. The wind was a roar, 1,000 voices screaming in a language she did not understand. She was so small. The prairie was so big. She was just a speck of dust being swept away. Her eyes drifted shut. The white turned to gray, and then to black. She felt a vague sense of regret that she hadn't fought harder, that she hadn't hit Charles back, that she hadn't run away when the sun was shining. But the regret was distant, fading like a footprint in the blizzard. The snow began to cover her. It filled the folds of her dress, settled in the hollow of her neck, smoothed over the shape of her body until she was nothing more than a bump in the landscape, a secret buried by the storm. The wind howled on, indifferent, erasing the world one flake at a time. Jesse Cole rode the line between the living and the dead. The distinction was often subtle in the Wyoming Territory, particularly when the sky turned the color of a bruised plum and the wind ceased to be air and became a solid, shoving force. He was mounted on a big, shaggy-coated bay gelding that kept its head low against the onslaught, its hooves punching through the crust of old snow to find the frozen earth beneath. Jesse adjusted the wool scarf wrapped around the lower half of his face, feeling the stiff crackle of ice that had formed on his mustache. He was a man built of wire and rawhide, sitting deep in the saddle with the unconscious grace of someone who had spent more of his 35 years on horseback than on his own feet. He wore a heavy buffalo coat that had seen better decades, the hide worn smooth at the elbows, layered over a canvas duster and a wool shirt that smelled of wood smoke and horses. The world around him had vanished. The horizon was gone, swallowed by a white void that erased the distinction between the earth and the sky. The silence of the high plains was usually a vast, open thing, but today it was different. Today, the silence was being murdered by the wind. It shrieked through the skeletal branches of the cottonwoods lining the creek bed a mile back, a sound like a woman screaming in the next room, muffled by a wall. Jesse narrowed his eyes against the stinging grit of the snow. He was looking for strays, foolish cattle that had wandered into the coulees to escape the wind, only to be buried when the drifts piled up. It was a fool's errand. He knew. The Circle T outfit paid him $40 a month and found to ride these fences. But nature paid no attention to wages or property lines. He shifted his weight, his knee aching. It was an old injury, a souvenir from a skirmish near the Powder River 7 years ago. The cold always found the old breaks first. He closed his mind to the pain, a trick he had learned in the army. You put the pain in a box, and you put the box on a shelf in the back of your mind, and you left it there until you had time to open it. His mind drifted, as it often did in the solitude, to the things he tried to keep buried alongside the pain. He remembered the heat of the South, the smell of black powder, and the sickening thud of lead hitting flesh. He had been a scout for the 3rd Cavalry, a job that required him to walk between two worlds and belong to neither. His father had been a trapper from Kentucky, a man of silence and sudden violence. His mother was Crow. Jesse carried his mother's high cheekbones and dark eyes, and his father's square jaw and stubbornness. To the white settlers, he was a half-breed, a man to be watched from the corner of the eye, useful for tracking but not for marrying their daughters. To the Crow, he was a ghost, a man who wore the blue coat of the soldiers who burned their winter food stores. He lived in the gray space between, a solitary creature who found comfort only in the vast indifference of the land. The bay horse snorted and sidestepped, jerking Jesse back to the present. The animal's ears flickered, swiveling toward a clump of sagebrush half buried in a growing drift to the left. "Easy," Jesse murmured, his voice a low rumble that barely carried over the wind. He squinted. There was a shape in the snow. It was dark, jagged, breaking the smooth contour of the drift. A calf, likely frozen stiff already, or close to it. He almost rode past. The storm was thickening, the flakes becoming larger, wetter, sticking to his eyelashes and blinding him. If he stopped for every dead calf, he would join them before nightfall. But the shape was wrong. It was too long, not huddled enough. Jesse reined the horse in, fighting the animal's desire to turn tail to the wind. He swung his leg over the saddle horn and dropped into the snow, sinking up to his thighs. The wind hit him instantly. Searching for the gaps in his coat, he waded toward the shape, his hand resting instinctively on the grip of the Colt Navy revolver at his hip, though the only enemy here was the weather. He reached the drift and brushed the snow away with a gloved hand. It was not a calf. The breath hissed out of him. It was a woman. She was curled in a tight ball, her knees drawn up to her chest, her arms wrapped around her head as if to ward off a blow. She wore a coat that was far too thin for this country, and a dress that was already freezing into a rigid shell. Jesse stood frozen for a heartbeat, his mind reeling. A woman. Out here, miles from the nearest homestead. It made no sense. It was a death sentence. He knelt, his knees crunching into the ice. He grabbed her shoulder and rolled her over. Her face was a mask of white, her skin the color of milk glass. Ice had crusted thick on her eyelashes, sealing her eyes shut. Her lips were a terrifying shade of blue. He pulled the glove from his right hand with his teeth and pressed his bare fingers against the side of her neck. His own hand was cold, but her skin felt like marble. He waited, holding his breath, feeling the wind tear at his back. There, a flutter, faint, erratic, like a dying bird trapped in a cage. But it was there, alive. Jesse looked up at the white wall of the storm. He knew what this meant. He knew the trouble that followed a white woman like a shadow, especially for a man with his face. If she died in his care, they would say he killed her. If she lived, they would whisper about what happened in the lonely hours of the storm. He looked down at her face. She was young, her features drawn tight with suffering. He saw the dark smear of a bruise on her jawline, unrelated to the cold. The hesitation lasted only a second. It was the old instinct, the one that had made him drag wounded men off the field while bullets slapped the dirt around him. You do not leave a living thing to the dark. He stood up and stripped off his buffalo coat. The cold hit him like a physical blow, a hammer to the chest that made him gasp. He wrapped the heavy coat around her stiff body, tucking the ends under her legs. Then he bent, scooped her up, and lifted her. She was dangerously light. It felt as if he were carrying a bundle of dry sticks. He fought his way back to the horse. The bay danced away, rolling its eyes, smelling the wrongness of the burden. "Stand," Jesse commanded, his voice sharp. He hoisted her up, draping her across the saddle like a sack of grain, then swung up behind her. He pulled her upright, settling her back against his chest, wrapping his arms around her to hold her in place. He could feel the terrifying cold radiating from her, seeping through his layers. "Let's go," he said to the horse. "Go home." The ride to the line cabin was a journey through a white hell. The world had ceased to exist. There was only the rhythmic crunch of hooves, the heaving of the horse's flanks, and the weight of the woman against him. Jesse kept his head down, navigating by the invisible pull of the land, by the direction of the wind, by an internal compass honed over years of riding the empty spaces. Twice the horse stumbled in badger holes hidden by the drifts. Twice Jesse had to haul on the reins to keep them upright, his arm tightening around the woman like an iron band. She did not groan. She did not shiver. That scared him more than anything. Shivering was life fighting back. Silence was surrender. The cabin appeared out of the gloom like a darker shadow against the gray. It was a rough structure, tucked into a stand of lodgepole pines that offered a meager windbreak. Jesse rode right up to the porch, sliding off the horse before the animal had fully stopped. He pulled the woman down, her body rigid and unyielding. He kicked the door, shattering the rim of ice that had sealed it shut. It swung open with a groan of rusted hinges. He carried her inside and kicked the door shut behind them, dropping the heavy wooden bar into place. The silence was sudden and shocking. The wind still howled, but it was outside now, a beast clawing at the walls. The cabin was freezing, the air stagnant and bitter. It was a single room, sparse and functional. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A bunk with a straw tick mattress sat in the corner. A table, 2 chairs, a shelf of tinned goods. Jesse laid the woman on the bunk. He did not light the lamp yet. He moved to the fireplace, his hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the numbness in his fingers. He shaved slivers of pitch pine, stacked kindling, and struck a lucifer match against the stone. The flame flared, blue and yellow, catching the resinous wood. He fed it larger sticks, then a split log, until the fire was roaring, sucking the draft up the chimney. Only then did he turn back to the bunk. He lit the coal oil lantern, the yellow light flooding the small space. He looked at her. She was a bundle of furs and wool, motionless. He knew what he had to do. He had seen frostbite take fingers, toes, noses. He had seen men die because they warmed up too fast, or because they stayed in wet clothes. He approached the bunk. His hands, scarred and brown, hovered over her. He felt a tremor go through him that had nothing to do with the cold. This was an intimacy that belonged to husbands, to lovers, or to the undertaker. He was none of those. "Forgive me, ma'am," he whispered to the silence. He unwrapped the buffalo coat. Beneath it, her dress was stiff with ice, the hem frozen into a jagged board. He unbuttoned her outer coat, his fingers clumsy on the small fastenings. He pulled it off. Then the dress. He had to use his knife to slice the laces of her boots, peeling the leather away from feet that were white and waxy. He stripped her down to her chemise and drawers, cotton garments that were damp with melted snow and sweat. He hesitated again, looking at the curve of her shoulder, the pale skin of her arms. He set his jaw. He peeled the wet linens from her skin, averting his eyes as much as he could, trying to see her not as a woman but as a casualty of war. He grabbed the rough wool blankets from the foot of the bunk, warming them briefly by the fire before wrapping her tightly. He piled every scrap of fabric he owned on top of her, his spare coat, the saddle blanket, a quilt his mother had sewn 30 years ago. He pulled a stool close to the fire and filled a pot with snow, setting it on the hook to melt. Then he began the slow work. He reached under the blankets and found her feet. They were cold as river stones. He held them in his hands, Not rubbing. Rubbing damaged the tissue, but simply holding, letting the warmth of his own blood seep into her. "Come on," he said softly. "Come back." He watched her face. The firelight danced across her features, softening the lines of pain. She was beautiful, in a severe, fragile way. Her hair had come loose from its pins, a dark spill against the rough pillow. Jesse sat there for an hour, then 2. He switched from her feet to her hands, chafing her wrists gently. The wind outside rose in pitch, a high, keening wail that shook the roof boards. He thought of the Little Bighorn. He hadn't been there, thank God. He was south with Crook, but he had seen the bodies afterward. He thought of a trooper named O'Malley he had found in a blizzard near Fort Robinson, frozen so hard they had to break his legs to fit him in the coffin. Not this one, he thought fiercely. Not this one. A sound came from the bunk, a gasp. Jessie leaned forward. Her eyes were moving behind the lids. Her chest hitched, a ragged inhalation that sounded like a sob. And then the shivering started. It began as a tremor in her jaw and spread instantly to her whole body. It was violent, a seizure-like shaking that rattled the bunk frame against the wall. Her teeth clacked together audibly. This was the danger point. The blood was returning to the surface, the core temperature rising, but the pain would be excruciating. Jesse moved to the side of the bunk. He placed his hands on her shoulders, holding her down as she thrashed. "Easy," he said, keeping his voice low and steady. "Easy now. You are safe." "No," she moaned. The word was a shattered thing. "No. Charles, please." The name hung in the air. "Charles, the husband, the man who wasn't here." Jessie felt a flash of anger, hot and sharp. Where was this Charles? Why was his wife dying in a snowbank? "I am not Charles," Jessie said. "You are safe." She didn't hear him. She was lost in the fever dream of rewarming. She cried out, incoherent pleas mixed with whimpers of pain. The burning in her fingers and toes must have been agonizing. Jessie grabbed a tin cup and dipped it into the pot of melted snow. He had added a pinch of salt and a strip of dried beef to make a weak broth. He lifted her head, slipping his arm behind her neck. "Drink," he commanded gently. She fought him at first, turning her head away, but the smell of the steam seemed to penetrate the fog. Her lips parted. He tilted the cup, letting a small amount of the warm liquid trickle into her mouth. She coughed, swallowed, and then greedily sought more. Slowly, he warned. He fed her the broth, spoonful by spoonful. He sat on the edge of the bunk, his hip pressing against the blankets. He was painfully aware of the heat of her body, the scent of her damp hair, the way her breath hitched in her throat. He had lived alone for 5 years. He had not touched a woman in 3, not since a brief, hollow encounter with a prostitute in Laramie that had left him feeling lonelier than before. He looked at the bruises on her arm, now visible as the sleeve of the chemise had ridden up. They were finger marks, old ones, yellow and green, and new ones, purple and angry. Jesse looked into the fire. He knew those marks. He had seen them on the women in the camps, and he had seen them on the wives of officers who wore white gloves and spoke of Christian charity. Cruelty spoke the same language in every tongue. Eliza shifted. The violent shivering was subsiding into a steady, exhaustion, deep trembling. Her breathing deepened, the lines of pain between her brows smoothed out. Jesse stood up to add a log to the fire. His legs were stiff. He felt drained, as if he had run 10 miles in deep snow. When he turned back, her eyes were open. They were gray eyes, the color of the storm clouds, but clear now. Lucid. She was staring at the ceiling, at the rough-hewn beams. Then she turned her head slowly. She saw the fire. She saw the stone chimney. She saw the saddlebags in the corner, the unfamiliar rifle hanging on the pegs. Confusion washed over her face, followed instantly by a dawn of absolute terror. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the log wall, pulling the blankets up to her chin. Her eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal, finally landing on him. Jesse stood by the hearth, the firelight casting his shadow long across the floor. He knew what he looked like to her, a savage, a threat, a large, scarred man in a lonely cabin. She opened her mouth to scream, but her throat was too dry, producing only a rasping croak. She clutched the blanket with white-knuckled desperation, realizing in that horrifying second that she was undressed beneath the wool. Jesse stepped back immediately, retreating toward the door to give her space. He raised his hands, palms open, showing he held no weapon. He lowered his head slightly, a gesture of submission, of harmlessness. "It is all right," he said. His voice was a deep baritone, rough like gravel but soft around the edges. "You are safe." "Who?" She gasped. Her voice was a whisper. "Where am I? My name is Jesse Cole. He said, I ride for the Circle T. I found you in the snow, about 4 miles east of here." Eliza stared at him. The memory was a fractured mirror. The whiteout, the cold, Charles riding away, the fall, and then darkness. "You found me?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." "You were nearly gone. I brought you here. It is my line cabin." She looked down at the blankets, then back at him. Her face flamed with a sudden, scorching heat that had nothing to do with the fire. "My clothes," she stammered. "They were frozen," Jesse said, his eyes fixed respectfully on a knot in the wood above her head. "They would have killed you. I had to take them off to get you warm. I hung them by the fire to dry." The shame hit her like a physical blow. She was a married woman, a church-going woman, lying naked in a stranger's bed. A man who was looking at the wall to avoid looking at her. She pulled the quilt tighter, wishing the floor would open up and swallow her. "Thank you," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. Jesse nodded once. He moved to the stove, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "I have some broth here," he said. "You need to eat." He poured another cup and brought it to her. He did not sit on the bunk this time. He placed the cup on the small stool within her reach and stepped back to the fireplace. Eliza reached for the cup. Her hand shook so badly the liquid slopped over the rim. She took a sip, the warmth spreading through her chest, grounding her. She looked at him over the rim of the cup. He was standing with his back to the fire, watching the door. He was tall, lean, with hair that hung past his collar, black as a raven's wing. His face was a map of hard living, a scar running through his left eyebrow, his skin dark. "You are," she started, then stopped. "I am," he said, answering the question she hadn't asked. "My mother was Crow." Eliza lowered the cup. "In the town, Charles called men like this devils. He said they were godless, violent animals. But this man had carried her. He had warmed her. He had covered her." "Where is Charles?" she asked, the memory of her husband returning with a fresh wave of nausea. "I saw no one else," Jesse said. "Just you. He left me." She said, "He." The truth spilled out before she could stop it. The horror of it, spoken aloud in this quiet room, sounded impossible. "He left me." Jesse's expression did not change, but his eyes hardened. He looked at the window. The snow was piled halfway up the glass now. The wind was battering the logs with renewed fury. "The storm is bad," Jesse said. "Worst I have seen in years." He looked at her then, and for the first time, their eyes truly met. She saw a profound sadness in his gaze, a mirrored reflection of her own loneliness. "We are stuck here, ma'am," he said quietly. "The pass will be closed. The drifts are already 5 feet deep. We are not going anywhere for a while." Eliza looked at the door, barred against the night. She looked at the man who was her savior and her jailer. She listened to the wind howling like a demon hunting for souls. She realized then that the world she knew, the world of rules, of propriety, of husbands and wives, had ended at the door of this cabin. In here, there was only the fire, the cold, and this stranger with the gentle hands and the sad eyes. She nodded slowly, sinking back against the rough pillow. "I am Eliza," she said. Jesse Cole nodded. "Rest. Eliza, I will keep the fire." He sat down on the floor, his back against the wall, wrapping his coat around his shoulders. He closed his eyes, but she knew he was not sleeping. He was listening to the wind, standing guard over her life. while the blizzard buried the world outside in a silence as deep as the grave. Time lost its shape inside the cabin. The rising and setting of the sun became theoretical concepts, irrelevant against the white tyranny pressing against the glass. For 3 days, the blizzard hammered the small structure with the malice of a living thing, burying them alive. The snow piled up past the single window, turning the light inside to a perpetual, murky twilight that smelled of wood smoke, damp wool, and the metallic tang of heated iron. The cabin was no more than 12 by 15 feet, a space that had felt sufficient for a solitary man who spent his days in the saddle. Now, with 2 people breathing the same air, navigating around the same table, and listening to the same relentless wind, it felt as intimate as the inside of a locket. Eliza Hart sat on the edge of the bunk, her hands gripping the rough wool of the blanket. She felt the cabin shudder under a particularly violent gust, a vibration that traveled up through the floorboards and into her bones. She was stronger today. The gray fog that had clouded her mind for the first 40 hours had lifted, leaving behind a sharp, brittle clarity. She could feel her toes again, though they throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, and the skin on her face felt tight and raw. She watched Jesse Cole. He was kneeling by the hearth, feeding a split log into the fire. His movements were economical and precise, the habits of a man who had learned that wasted motion meant wasted energy. He wore his heavy wool shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and marked by the white tracery of old scars. "I can help," Eliza said. Her voice sounded loud in the small room, raspy from disuse. Jesse turned his head. The firelight caught the sharp angles of his face, the high cheekbones, and the dark, unreadable eyes. "You should rest," he said. "You took a hard chill. Eliza, it takes time to thaw out the marrow. I cannot just sit here," she insisted. "I feel useless, like a piece of furniture you have to dust around." She pushed herself up, her legs trembling slightly. She reached for the broom that leaned against the wall, a crude thing made of stiff grass and a willow branch. She took a step toward the center of the room, intending to sweep the packed earth floor, but the room tilted. The blood rushed from her head, and the floor seemed to surge up to meet her. She swayed, reaching out blindly for support. Jesse was there before she could fall. He did not grab her roughly. His hands caught her elbows with a firm, steadying grip, holding her upright until the world stopped spinning. For a moment, she was pressed against him. The smell of him, pine pitch, tobacco, and honest sweat, filling her senses. It was a masculine scent, earthier and cleaner than the bay rum and stale whiskey smell of Charles. "Easy," he murmured. His voice vibrated in his chest against her shoulder. Eliza pulled back, flushing hot with embarrassment. "I am sorry. I am clumsy." "You are not clumsy," Jesse said, guiding her back to the bunk. "You are recovering. There is no shame in being human." He sat her down and stepped back quickly, reestablishing the invisible line he had drawn between them since the moment she woke up. It was a line of propriety, of safety. He slept on the floor near the hearth, wrapped in his buffalo coat, leaving the bunk entirely to her. When he moved past her to get water or wood, he turned his body to maximize the distance, his eyes fixed on some neutral point in the room. Eliza hated the distance as much as she needed it. She felt the weight of her intrusion. She was another mouth to feed from his limited stores, a complication in his simple life. "I am eating your food," she said, watching him return to the fire. "I am burning your wood, and I cannot even sweep the floor." Jesse picked up the poker and jabbed at the logs. The sparks swirled up the chimney. "The wood is there to be burned," he said without looking at her. "The food is there to be eaten. If you were not here, I would be talking to the mice. They are poor conversationalists. They never answer back." Eliza surprised herself by smiling. It was a small, fragile thing, but it cracked the mask of misery she had worn for so long. "Do you talk to the mice often, Mr. Cole?" "Jesse," he corrected gently. "And yes, when the snow is this deep, a man will talk to his boots if they look at him friendly enough." The tension in the room eased. "Just a fraction." Eliza drew her knees up. "Just a fraction. wrapping the quilt around her shoulders. "I used to talk to the garden," she confessed, "back in Cincinnati. We had a patch of roses my mother loved. I would tell them everything I couldn't tell my sisters." "Cincinnati," Jessie repeated. "That is a long way from the Wyoming Territory. A lifetime," she said. The conversation drifted then, meandering like a slow creek. They spoke not of the storm or the husband who had abandoned her, but of small, safe things. Eliza talked about the heavy, humid heat of Ohio summers, the sound of riverboats on the Ohio River, and the taste of fresh apples in October. Jessie listened with a quiet intensity, asking questions that showed he was truly hearing her. In turn, he offered up fragments of himself, like pieces of sea glass washed up on a shore. He told her about growing up near the Yellowstone, about a horse he once had that could open gate latches with its teeth, and about the silence of the high mountains where the air was so thin it felt like drinking cold water. "Did you have family?" Eliza asked, emboldened by the firelight and the isolation. Jessie hesitated. He was whittling a piece of kindling with a pocket knife, the shavings curling onto the hearth. "I had a sister," he said softly. "Her name was Sarah. She was small, like a bird. She had a laugh that could make a rock smile." Eliza leaned forward. "Where is she now?" "She died," Jessie said. His knife paused, then sliced a long, thin strip of wood. "The smallpox came through the winter camps when I was 12. It took her and my mother in the same week." "Oh, Jessie," Eliza breathed. "I am so sorry." He shrugged, a motion that carried the weight of old grief accepted long ago. "It is the way of things out here. The land takes what it wants. You learn to carry the memory without letting the weight break your back." Eliza looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the lines of sorrow etched around his mouth, the guardedness in his eyes that spoke of a man who had learned to expect loss. He was a hard man, shaped by a hard world, yet there was no cruelty in him. He looked up and caught her staring. For a heartbeat, the air between them grew thin and charged. Then Jessie cleared his throat and stood up. "I should check the stove," he said abruptly. "The wind is shifting north. It will be colder tonight, as the days turned into nights and back into gray days." The cabin transformed from a shelter into a world of its own. The blizzard sealed them in a capsule of time. The routines of survival, melting snow for water, rationing the dried beef and beans, keeping the fire fed, became a shared liturgy. Eliza grew stronger. She could stand now without dizziness, and she insisted on taking over the cooking, such as it was. Jessie yielded the skillet to her, watching from the corner as she moved around the small stove. One evening, while trying to fry cornbread in the heavy cast-iron spider, Eliza became distracted by a story Jessie was telling about a bear that had broken into a trapper's cabin and eaten nothing but the sugar. "And he left the flour?" Eliza asked, laughing. "Left it untouched," Jessie said, grinning, "but he smashed the whiskey jug. The trapper was more mad about the liquor than the door." Eliza laughed, a genuine bell-like sound that seemed to startle the shadows in the corners. In that moment of distraction, the smell of burning cornmeal filled the air. "Oh no!" she cried, grabbing the handle of the skillet. She hissed as the hot iron burned her fingers through the rag, and she dropped the pan onto the stovetop with a clatter. Jessie was at her side instantly. He grabbed her hand, plunging it into the bucket of cold meltwater. "Careful," he said. They stood there, shoulder to shoulder, her hand in the water, his hand holding her wrist. The smell of burnt bread hung heavy in the air, but neither of them moved. Eliza looked up at him. He was close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark irises, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his chest. His thumb brushed the inside of her wrist, a touch so light it was almost imagined. Her pulse hammered against his skin. "I burned our supper," she whispered. "It is just a little well done," Jessie said. His voice was rougher than usual. "I have eaten worse. I have eaten boot leather boiled in snow." He did not let go of her wrist. His gaze dropped to her arm. The sleeve of her dress had been pushed up to keep it dry, exposing the skin of her forearm. There, fading but still visible against the pale flesh, were the yellow-green remnants of finger marks. 4 on top, 1 on the bottom, the grip of a man's hand. Jesse went still. His thumb traced the edge of the bruise, a feather-light contact that sent a shiver racing down Eliza's spine. She saw his jaw muscle tighten, a rhythmic clenching of teeth. Eliza tried to pull her hand away, shame flooding her face. I bumped into the doorframe. Before the storm. Jesse looked at her. His eyes were not angry at her. They were burning with a cold, terrifying fury directed at a ghost. He did not call her a liar. He did not force her to say the name. He held her gaze. And in that silence, a conversation happened that was louder than words. He knew. He knew that doors did not grab women by the arm. He knew that bruises like that came from fear and control. He remembered the officers he had scouted for. Men with polished boots and hollow souls who treated their wives like unruly horses to be broken. Eliza looked away, unable to bear the intensity of his understanding. It was easier when people didn't know. When they didn't know. She could pretend it was normal. She could pretend she was clumsy. But Jesse stripped away the pretense without speaking a word. He slowly released her wrist. "I will scrape off the burnt parts," he said quietly. "It will be fine." Eliza. That night, the conversation turned to the things they had left behind. "You never speak of him," Jesse said. "He was sitting on the floor, whittling again, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows." Eliza sat on the bunk, hugging her knees. She knew who he meant. There is not much to say. She lied. Charles is a difficult man. He has a hard temper. The West has not been kind to him. The West is hard on everyone. Jesse said, "That is no excuse for cruelty." "It is not just cruelty," Eliza defended weakly, falling into the old habit of rationalization. "He is disappointed. He wanted to be a great man. He wanted to build a city. Now he is just a man in a shack." "And that is your fault?" Jesse asked. "He thinks so," she whispered. "He thinks I hold him back. He thinks I am too weak." Jesse stopped whittling. He looked at the fire, his profile sharp and severe. "I have seen weak people. Eliza, I have seen men who crumble when the wind blows too hard. You walked through a blizzard. You survived the ice. You are sitting here, holding your head up. You are not weak." Eliza felt tears prick her eyes. She blinked them back furiously. No one had told her she was strong in 3 years. She had been told she was foolish, slow, clumsy, and fragile. "I was afraid," she admitted. "When he left me, I was so afraid." Jesse turned to look at her. "Fear is sense. Only a fool is not afraid of the storm. It is what you do with the fear that matters." You kept walking. He stood up and walked to the window, scraping a small hole in the frost with his fingernail. "The wind is dying down," he said, "but the cold is settling. The bottom is dropping out of the thermometer." He was right. As the howling of the wind faded, a deep, resonant silence descended on the cabin, and with it came a cold that was terrifying in its intensity. The logs of the cabin popped and groaned as the sap froze deep inside the wood. The frost on the window grew thick and opaque, like white moss. By midnight, the temperature inside the cabin had plummeted. The fire was roaring, Jesse feeding it every spare piece of wood they had, but the heat was sucked away the moment it left the hearth. The water in the bucket, standing only 5 feet from the fire, had a skim of ice on it. Eliza lay under the pile of blankets, shivering. She was wearing her dress, her coat, and everything Jesse had given her, but the cold was seeping up through the mattress, a damp, numbing chill that made her teeth chatter. Jesse was pacing. He had put on every layer he owned, but he was still shivering. He checked the fire again. "It is not enough," he said, his voice tight. "What?" Eliza asked, her voice trembling. "The fire," he said. "It is 40 below, maybe 50. The draft is pulling the heat out as fast as I make it." He looked at her, then looked away, wrestling with himself. He rubbed the back of his neck, his posture rigid. "Eliza," he said, and stopped. He took a breath. "You are shivering." I will be fine," she stuttered. "You will not," he said bluntly. "Not tonight. This is the kind of cold that kills you in your sleep. It slows the heart until it just stops." He turned to face her. His expression was pained, his eyes dark with a mixture of necessity and reluctance. "We have to combine our heat," he said. "It is the only way." Eliza stared at him. The implication hung in the freezing air. To share the bunk, to lie with him. "You mean sleep together," she whispered. "I mean survive," Jesse said. He held up his hands, as if to show they were clean. "I will keep my coat on. I will stay on top of the covers if you want, or underneath if it's too cold. But we need to share the warmth. If we stay apart, one of us might not wake up." Eliza looked at the fire, battling the dying flames. She looked at the ice on the water bucket. She felt the numbness creeping into her toes again, the same numbness she had felt in the snowdrift. She looked at Jesse. He was not leering. He looked terrified, not of the cold, but of offending her, of crossing a line he held sacred. He was a man of honor asking to break a rule to save her life. She moved to the far side of the narrow bunk, pressing herself against the log wall. She pulled the heavy quilts up to her chin. "Come," she said softly. "Before the fire dies?" Jesse hesitated for one last second. Then he blew out the lantern, plunging the room into the soft, flickering orange of the firelight. He walked to the bunk. He sat on the edge and removed his boots, his movements stiff. Then, fully clothed in his heavy wool trousers and flannel shirt, he lay down beside her. The bunk was narrow. There was no way to avoid contact. As he settled, his shoulder brushed hers. The heat coming off him was startling, a furnace blast against her chilled side. He lay on his back, rigid as a board, his arms crossed over his chest, staring up at the shadowy ceiling. He kept a respectful inch of space between their bodies, a canyon of cold air that the blankets struggled to bridge. Eliza lay on her side, facing him. She could see his profile in the dying light of the fire. She could hear his breathing. Slow, controlled, measured. Minutes passed. The cold in the room deepened. The inch of space between them felt like a refrigerator door left open. Eliza's shivering increased. She couldn't stop it. Her body convulsed in small, rhythmic spasms. Jesse let out a sharp exhale through his nose. "Come here," he said gruffly. "It is no use if we don't touch." He turned on his side, facing her. He opened his arms, not in an embrace of passion, but of shelter. Eliza did not hesitate. The cold was an animal biting at her spine. She shifted across the mattress and pressed herself against him. His arms closed around her. He pulled her tight against his chest, wrapping his body around hers to shield her from the drafts. She buried her face in the rough wool of his shirt, smelling the wood smoke and the man. The warmth was immediate and overwhelming. It soaked into her frozen clothes, penetrating to her skin. She felt the solid, steady thud of his heart against her ear. It was a strong, slow beat, an anchor in the storm. For the first time in years, Eliza felt completely safe. It was a confusing, terrifying realization. She was in the arms of a man who was not her husband, a man the world called a savage, a man she had known for 4 days. And yet, she felt a sense of peace she had never known in Charles's house. She stopped shivering. Her body relaxed, melting into the curve of his. Jesse went rigid again as she relaxed. He held his breath, having her this close, the softness of her curves, the scent of her hair, the trust in the way she clung to him, was a torture he hadn't anticipated. Every instinct in his body screamed to hold her tighter, to stroke her hair, to offer comfort that went beyond survival. But he did not move his hands. He kept them flat against her back, chaste and protective. He was a line rider. He knew where the boundaries were. He knew that she was vulnerable, that she was married, that she was frightened. To take advantage of this necessity would be a sin worse than murder. Eliza sighed, a long, ragged sound of contentment. Her hand, which had been clenched in a fist against his chest, slowly uncurled. Her fingers rested over his heart. "Thank you, Jesse," she whispered into the dark. He swallowed hard, his throat tight. "Sleep, Eliza." She did sleep. Exhaustion and warmth pulled her down into a deep, dreamless slumber. But Jesse lay awake. He stared at the dying embers of the fire, feeling the rise and fall of her breath against his ribs. He felt the ghost of a life he could never have. He felt the terrible, beautiful weight of her trust. He knew, with a sinking certainty, that the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm rising in his chest. He wanted to protect her. He wanted to keep her warm. He wanted to kill the man who had put those bruises on her arm. And God help him. He wanted to stay in this frozen cabin forever, because he knew that the moment the snow melted, he would have to give her back to the world that had broken her. He closed his eyes, listening to the wind die, and prayed for the strength to be the man she needed him to be, rather than the man he wanted to be. The silence woke them before the light did. For days, the cabin had been a drum beaten by the fists of the wind, a vibrating, groaning vessel adrift in a sea of noise. Now, the air was so still that the pop of a shifting log in the cooling stove sounded like a pistol shot. Jesse moved first. He rose from the hard floor where he had slept since that one desperate night of shared warmth. Shaking the stiffness from his limbs, he went to the door and lifted the heavy wooden bar. He pushed. The door did not move. It was sealed fast, not by a lock, but by the accumulated weight of the drift that had buried them. He braced his shoulder against the rough planks and shoved. Grunting with the effort, the wood groaned, and a hairline crack of blinding white light pierced the gloom of the cabin. With a final heave, he forced the door outward enough to squeeze through. He grabbed the shovel that leaned by the jamb and stepped into the void. Eliza sat up in the bunk, pulling the buffalo coat tighter around her shoulders. She watched him disappear into the wall of white. She heard the rhythmic scrape and toss of the shovel, the grunt of exertion. She swung her legs over the edge of the mattress and pulled on her boots, her fingers fumbling with the laces in the morning chill. When she stepped to the threshold, the sight that greeted her stole the breath from her lungs. The world had been scrubbed clean. The violent gray fury of the blizzard was gone, replaced by a sky of piercing, relentless blue. It was a hard sky, stretched taut over a landscape that was no longer recognizable. The familiar contours of the plains, the dip of the creek bed, the rise of the sagebrush knolls were gone. In their place was a sculpted ocean of white, rolling and smooth, undulating waves that sparkled with a diamond-hard brilliance. The sun was a cold white coin, offering light but no heat. Jesse was waist-deep in the trench he was cutting away from the porch. He paused, leaning on the shovel, his breath pluming in the crystal air like dragon smoke. He looked at her, his eyes narrowed against the glare. "It is done," he said. Eliza stepped out onto the porch. The cold was immediate, a physical weight that pressed against her skin, sharpening her senses. She looked at the vast, frozen emptiness. It was beautiful, terrifyingly so. It was a landscape that did not care if she lived or died. It was indifferent, massive, and pure. She looked at the shovel in Jesse's hands, then at the path he was clearing. "We can leave," she said. The words felt heavy, dropping like stones into the silence. Jesse looked out toward the horizon, where the mountains were etched in jagged white lines against the blue. "Not today," he said. "The snow is too soft. The horse would flounder before we went a mile. The crust needs to harden. Maybe tomorrow, maybe the day after." He looked back at her. "But the storm is broken." Eliza nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. The storm was broken. Yes, but the breaking of the storm meant the return of the world. For days, the cabin had been a sanctuary, a suspended reality where the laws of society and the pain of her past could not reach her. Now, the blue sky was a reminder that time had started moving again. She turned back into the cabin, the sudden brightness of the outside making the interior feel like a cave. She moved to the stove, adding wood, setting the coffee pot to boil. Her hands shook, not from cold, but from a sudden, crashing wave of anxiety. The silence that stretched between them that morning was different from the companionable quiet of the blizzard. It was heavy with things unsaid. Jesse worked outside for hours, clearing a path to the small lean-to where the horse was kept, digging out the wood pile. Eliza cleaned the already clean plates, folded the blankets, and swept the floor. When Jesse finally came inside for the noon meal, stamping the snow from his boots, the cabin felt smaller than it ever had. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stood by the window. "Looking out, the drifts are deep," he said. "It will be hard going when we do leave." Eliza sat at the table, her hands clasped tight in her lap. "Where will we go?" she asked. The question hung in the air, simple and devastating. Jesse turned slowly. "To town," he said. "It is the only place. You need supplies. You need to be returned." Returned. The word tasted like bile. Returned like a lost parcel. Returned to the man who had thrown her away. "I cannot go back to him," she whispered. Jesse set his cup down on the sill. He did not come closer, but his gaze was intense, pinning her to the chair. "You are his wife, Eliza, in the eyes of the law, in the eyes of the church. If I take you anywhere else, they will hunt us down. They will say I kidnapped you. Let them say it," she cried, the sudden flash of anger surprising even her. "I would rather be lost than found by him." Jesse crossed the room in 2 long strides and pulled out the chair opposite her. He sat down, leaning forward, his elbows on the table. "Eliza, look at me." She raised her eyes. He was close, his face weathered and scarred, his expression grim but gentle. "You have to tell me," he said. "You have to tell me exactly what happened. Not the sketches, not the hints. If I am to ride into town with you, if I am to stand between you and whatever comes next, I need to know the truth. All of it." Eliza looked at his hands, resting on the rough wood of the table. Strong hands. Hands that had warmed her frozen feet. Hands that had fed her when she could not feed herself. She took a breath, and the dam broke. It was not a single moment. She began, her voice trembling. It was 1,000 moments. It was the way he looked at me when the store in Cheyenne failed, as if I were the anchor dragging him down. It was the way he drank until his eyes went dead. She looked up, meeting Jesse's gaze. He hit me. Jesse, not once, many times. He would strike me and then cry, saying the whiskey made him do it, saying he was a man under pressure. And I believed him. Or I tried to. I told myself a wife bears the burden of her husband's sorrow. Jesse's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. But he did not speak. But the storm. Eliza's voice dropped to a whisper. She was back there, in the whiteout, feeling the wind tear at her dress. He found the money I had hidden. Just a few dollars for flour. He went mad. He said I was stealing his manhood. He dragged me out. He didn't just leave me. Jesse, he threw me. Tears spilled over her lashes, hot and fast. She wiped them away angrily. He put me in the snow. He told me to find my own way. He knew I couldn't see the barn. He knew I couldn't see the house. He got on his horse and he rode away. He left me to die. He wanted the cold to do what he was too cowardly to do with his hands. She was shaking now, her whole body vibrating with the force of the memory. I crawled. She choked out. I crawled, and I prayed, and I called his name. And when I couldn't crawl anymore, I lay down and I thought, this is what I am worth. I am worth nothing. I am trash to be buried by the snow. Silence filled the room, thicker than the smoke from the stove. Jesse stared at her, his face a mask of controlled fury. His hands were clenched into fists on the table, the knuckles white. He did not look surprised. That was the terrible thing. He looked like a man who had read this story 100 times in the book of human misery. Eliza looked down at her lap. "I should have died," she whispered. "It would have been cleaner." "Don't," Jesse said. His voice was a low growl. "Do not say that." He stood up, the chair scraping loud and harsh against the floor. He walked to the fireplace and gripped the mantel, staring into the flames. "I have seen it before," he said, his back to her. "During the campaigns, in '68, on the Washita. I was scouting for Custer then." He paused, and the name hung in the room like a curse. "We rode into the winter camps at dawn." He continued, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, which made it all the more terrifying. The orders were to drive them out, to burn the lodges, to kill the ponies. He turned his head slightly, looking at her over his shoulder. "I saw women running in the snow, carrying their babies, barefoot on the ice. I saw soldiers, men I ate supper with. Shoot them down because they were slow, because they were in the way, because they could. He turned fully around, his eyes dark with old ghosts. Power makes men sick. Eliza, when a man feels small, he tries to make himself big by crushing something softer than he is. Your husband, he is one of those men. He is a weak man who thinks cruelty is strength. He walked back to the table and stood over her. But you, he said, you are not trash. You are iron. You are the toughest thing I have ever seen. Eliza looked up at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw the pain in his eyes, the guilt he carried from wars that were not his own. She saw a man who had been used by the world just as she had, a man who had been told he was less, that he was a tool, a savage, a half-breed. "Jesse," she said softly. She stood up. She was trembling, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "The only time I have felt safe, the only time in 5 years I have felt like a human being, is in this room, with you." She took a step closer. The air between them seemed to crackle, charged with the electricity of the days they had spent trapped together, the nights they had spent listening to each other breathe. "You saved me," she said. "You didn't know me." "You owed me nothing, but you brought me in. You warmed me." Jesse looked down at her. His expression crumbled, the hard lines of the scout melting into something raw and vulnerable. "I couldn't leave you," he whispered. Eliza reached out and took his hand. It was rough, calloused, swallowing hers. "You are the only warmth I have known," she said. The confession hung there, naked and terrifying. It was an admission of more than gratitude. It was an admission of a need so deep it terrified her. Jesse made a sound in his throat, a sound like something breaking. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them. He raised his hand and cupped her face. His thumb brushed away a tear that tracked down her cheek. His touch was incredibly gentle, reverent, as if she were made of spun glass. "You deserved better. Eliza," he said, his voice thick. "You deserved a man who would build a wall against the wind for you, not throw you into it." The kindness in his eyes broke her. It shattered the last of her reserve. She leaned into his hand, closing her eyes, a sob escaping her throat. "Jesse," she breathed. He lowered his head. She rose to meet him. The kiss was not like the kisses in the stories she had read as a girl. It was not polite. It was desperate. It tasted of salt and coffee and smoke. It started slow. A question asked and answered, lips brushing tentatively. Then, as if a dam had burst, it deepened. Jesse's arms went around her, pulling her against him. He felt solid, immovable, a rock in the stream of her life. Eliza clutched at his shirt, bunching the fabric in her fists, pulling him closer. She poured everything into that kiss, the terror of the snow, the loneliness of the prairie, the bitterness of her marriage, and the overwhelming, terrifying gratitude she felt for this man. For a moment, the world narrowed down to the heat of their bodies. The fire popped, the wind whispered outside. But they were the only two people on earth. Jesse's hand tangled in her hair, tilting her head back. She felt the roughness of his beard against her skin, the frantic beat of his heart against her chest. It was a hunger that had been starving in both of them for years. His hands moved down her back, pressing her hips against his. The intimacy was sudden and shocking. The desire that flared in her belly was sharp and hot. She wanted him. She wanted to erase the memory of Charles's cold hands with the fire of this man. Jessie groaned, a low sound against her mouth. He walked her backward until her legs hit the edge of the table. He lifted her, setting her on the edge, moving between her knees. It would be so easy. The bunk was 5 feet away. The door was barred. The world was gone. Then, suddenly, Jessie stiffened. He tore his mouth away from hers, gasping for air. He pulled back, his hands gripping her shoulders, holding her at arm's length. His chest was heaving. His eyes were wide, black, dilated with desire, but also with panic. "No," he rasped. Eliza stared at him, her lips swollen, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. "Why?" she whispered. Jesse squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, fighting a battle she could only guess at. When he opened them, the darkness was still there, but the steel had returned. "Because I will not be that man," he said. He stepped back, putting 3 feet of floor between them. He ran a hand through his hair, his fingers shaking. "I will not take you like a thief in the night. Eliza, you are vulnerable. You are hurt. You are scared. If I take you to that bed now, I am no better than the men who take what isn't theirs just because they found it." He looked at her, and his gaze was pleading. "You are married," he said. "The law says you belong to him. The law is wrong," Eliza cried. "He forfeited his right when he left me to die." "Maybe," Jesse said, "but the world doesn't see it that way. And you, Eliza, you need to be free, truly free, not just hiding in a cabin. If we do this, if we cross this line, I want it to be because you chose it with a clear head, in the light of day, not because you were cold and I was the only fire." Eliza slid off the table, her legs shaking so hard she had to grab the edge to stay upright. The rejection stung, sharp and bitter, but beneath the sting, she felt the truth of his words. He was protecting her honor, even when she didn't care about it. He was offering her a respect she had never known. She wrapped her arms around her waist, turning away from him to hide the flush on her face. "I am not free," she whispered. "I am still Mrs. Charles Hart." Jesse moved to the fireplace, turning his back to the room. He leaned his forehead against the rough stone of the chimney. "We have to go to town," he said. His voice was muffled. "As soon as the crust hardens." Eliza looked at his broad back. She realized then that he was scared too. He was scared of his own want. He was scared of what it would cost him to love her. "To town," she repeated dully. "We will find the marshal," Jesse said, turning around. "We will tell him what happened. We will tell him Charles tried to kill you. He will deny it," Eliza said. "He is a white man of business. You are. I am a half-breed scout." Jesse finished for her. "I know. They will believe him. They will say I stole you. They will say I turned your head." "Then why go?" Eliza asked. "Why not just ride north? We could go to Montana. We could disappear. Because you would always be looking over your shoulder," Jesse said. "And I will not have you live like a fugitive. You did nothing wrong." He walked over to her, stopping just outside the circle of her personal space. He did not touch her, but his eyes held hers. "I will ride with you, Eliza. I will walk into that town with you. I will stand next to you while you look him in the eye, and I will not let him touch you again." The promise hung in the air, solemn as a vow. "It will be dangerous," Eliza said. "Charles is a coward, but cowards are dangerous when they are cornered. And the town, they don't like you, Jesse. They tolerate you because you are useful, but they don't like you." "I know," Jesse said. He looked at the rifle hanging on the wall. "I have spent my whole life walking into places where I wasn't wanted." He said, "This time, at least I know what I am fighting for." Eliza felt a shiver go through her. It was not the cold. It was the realization that this man, this quiet, scarred stranger, was willing to bleed for her. She straightened her spine. She wiped the last tear from her cheek. "When do we leave?" she asked. Jesse looked out the window at the blinding white snow. "Tomorrow," he said, "at dawn." The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparation. They were efficient, avoiding each other's gaze, careful not to brush arms in the small space. The kiss hung between them, a ghost that refused to be exorcised. Every time Eliza looked at Jesse, she felt the phantom pressure of his mouth on hers. Every time Jesse looked at Eliza, he saw the woman he wanted more than his next breath, and the woman he had to walk through fire to keep. Night fell, cold and absolute. The sky was a vast dome of stars, sharp and uncaring. They ate in silence. When it was time to sleep, Jesse took his customary place on the floor. Eliza lay in the bunk, staring at the ceiling. "Jesse?" she whispered into the dark. "Yeah, are you afraid?" There was a long pause. The fire popped. "Yes," he said. "Me too." She rolled over, pulling the quilt up to her chin. "Good night, Jesse. Good night, Eliza. Outside." The wind began to pick up again. a low moan across the snow-packed plains, but inside, the silence was louder. It was the silence of people who have made a choice that cannot be unmade. Tomorrow, they would leave the sanctuary. Tomorrow, they would face the world. Tomorrow, they would find out if love was enough to survive the truth. The journey back to civilization was a slow, wet slog through a country that looked as if it had been chewed up and spat out by a wolf. The blinding blue sky that had dawned over the cabin gave way by mid-morning to a flat, glaring white sun that turned the drifts into heavy, treacherous slush. The Chinook wind had come down from the mountains, warm and restless, eating the snow with a voracious appetite. Jesse Cole rode the bay gelding, keeping the animal at a steady, plodding walk. Eliza sat behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist, her face pressed against the rough wool of his coat. She rode astride, her dress bunched up, wearing Jesse's spare trousers underneath to protect her legs from the chafing wet. The physical intimacy that had been a necessity in the cabin was now a public declaration, unavoidable and damning. The land was revealing its dead. As the snow receded, it exposed the carcasses of cattle that had huddled in the coulees and suffocated. They lay like dark, bloated stones against the melting white, their stiff legs pointing at the sky. Ravens, black as ink drops, hopped on the bodies, taking flight with harsh croaks as the horse splashed past. Jesse did not speak. He scanned the horizon. His eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his hat. He felt the tension in Eliza's arms, the way her grip tightened every time the horse slipped in the mud. He knew what they were riding toward. The blizzard had been a physical enemy, honest and simple. The town was a human enemy, complicated and treacherous. They reached the outskirts of Red Rock just past noon. The town was a collection of raw lumber buildings strung out along a muddy scar of a road. The snow here had been churned into a brown slurry by wagon wheels and hooves. Men were on the roofs of the buildings, shoveling off the heavy drifts to keep the beams from cracking. The sound of their arrival was the sucking pop of hooves in mud. A man clearing the boardwalk in front of the livery stable stopped his shovel mid-swing. He leaned on the handle, squinting at them. It was Silas Webb, the blacksmith. He chewed a plug of tobacco, his jaw working slowly as he took in the sight. A woman, disheveled and worn, riding double with a half-breed scout, wearing a man's coat. Jesse felt the weight of the look. It was a look he had known since he was a boy, a mixture of curiosity and disdain. He kept his back straight, looking neither left nor right. Eliza shrank against him. She recognized Silas. She had bought a skillet from his brother 3 months ago. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks, the shame of her condition warring with the truth of her survival. They rode down the center of the main street. The activity of the town seemed to stutter and slow. A woman carrying a basket of eggs paused on the boardwalk, whispering to her companion. A group of men standing outside the saloon stopped talking, their heads turning in unison like cattle watching a wolf. Jesse pulled the horse up in front of the general store. He swung his leg over the saddle horn and dropped into the muck, the mud splashing over his boot tops. He reached up, his hands spanning Eliza's waist. "Steady," he said quietly. He lifted her down. For a second, her feet dangled, and she was entirely in his power, held against his chest. The contact was brief, but in the watching street, it looked like a caress. He set her down on the boardwalk, keeping his hand on her elbow to steady her. Eliza looked at the store window. Her reflection ghosted back at her, hair windblown, face ruddy from the cold, wearing a coat that swallowed her frame. She looked wild. She looked like a woman who had walked out of the grave. She took a breath, steeling herself. "I have to know," she whispered. Jesse nodded. He tied the horse to the rail. "I am right behind you." They entered the store. The bell above the door jingled, a cheerful sound that seemed out of place. The air inside smelled of coffee beans, leather, and sawdust. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, was behind the counter, measuring out navy beans for Mrs. Gable, the banker's wife. The conversation stopped instantly. "Eliza?" "Mrs." Gable gasped. She dropped the small sack she was holding. It hit the floor with a soft thud. "We thought everyone said you were dead." Eliza stepped forward, her boots sounding heavy on the floorboards. "I'm alive. Mrs. Gable. Mr." Henderson came around the counter, wiping his hands on his apron. His eyes darted from Eliza to Jessie, who stood silently by the door, a dark shadow against the light. "Charles said you wandered off." Henderson said, "He said you panicked in the storm. He's been beside himself. Mrs. Hart. Beside himself." "Where is he?" Eliza asked. Her voice was thin, brittle as ice. "He is at the boarding house." Henderson said, "He took a room. He said the cabin was too far to search from. He has been mourning you, ma'am. He was ordering a marker for the grave just this morning." "A marker?" The hypocrisy of it struck Eliza like a slap. Charles was planning to bury an empty box and play the grieving widower. Eliza turned and walked out. She did not wait for their questions. She could feel Jessie's presence at her back, a solid wall pushing her forward. They walked the 50 yards to the boarding house. The mud sucked at Eliza's boots. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. A frantic bird trying to escape a cage. She was terrified. Not of the physical violence, Jessie was there, but of the power Charles held. He was the husband. He was the merchant. He was the white man who spoke the language of the town. She pushed open the door of the boarding house. The front room was warm, heated by a potbelly stove. Several men sat in armchairs, smoking pipes. In the center of the room, sitting at a small table with a plate of ham and eggs, was Charles. He looked healthy. He was clean-shaven, his hair combed with pomade. He wore a fresh shirt. There was a glass of whiskey near his hand. He was laughing at something the man next to him had said. Eliza stood in the doorway, the cold air from the street swirling around her. "Charles." The name was not a shout. It was a statement. Charles froze. The fork hovered halfway to his mouth. He turned his head slowly. When he saw her, the color drained from his face, leaving it the color of old parchment. For a second, Eliza saw the naked truth in his eyes. Disappointment. He had wanted her dead. He had counted on it. Then, the mask slammed down. He dropped the fork and scrambled to his feet, knocking the chair over. "Eliza!" he cried. His voice was loud, theatrical. "My God, Eliza!" He rushed toward her, arms open. He looked like a man greeting a miracle. "I thought I had lost you," he shouted. "Performing for the audience in the room. I searched. I rode until the horse collapsed." "Oh, my poor, dear girl." He reached for her. Eliza stepped back. The movement was small, but it was a rejection so absolute it stopped him in his tracks. "Do not touch me," she said. Charles blinked, his smile faltering. "Eliza, you are hysterical. You have been out in the cold. You don't know what you are saying. I know exactly what I am saying," she said. Her voice gained strength, fueled by the sight of his clean shirt and his whiskey glass. "You did not search. You rode away." Charles's eyes narrowed. He looked past her and saw Jessie standing in the doorway. Jessie had not entered the room fully. He stood on the threshold, leaning one shoulder against the jamb, his hand resting casually near his belt. Charles's face changed. The shock vanished, replaced by a sneer of recognition and opportunity. "Coal." Charles spat. He looked back at Eliza, and his voice dropped to a pitch designed to carry, designed to hurt. "So that is it. I see. I thought you were dead. Eliza, I was praying for your soul. And all this time, you were shacked up with him?" The room went silent. The men in the armchairs leaned forward. The landlady peered out from the kitchen. "You were with this vagrant?" Charles demanded, pointing a shaking finger at Jessie. "For 3 days? While I was out risking my life to find you? He lied so easily, it was breathtaking. I saved her. Jessie said—" His voice was a low rumble, cutting through Charles's bluster. "I found her in a drift 4 miles from your cabin. She was half dead." Charles laughed. A sharp, barking sound. "Saved her? Is that what you call it? A woman alone, a man like you, a cabin cut off from the world? We know what you are. Cole, we know what your kind does to white women." He turned to the room, spreading his hands. "Look at her!" Charles shouted. "Look at my wife!" Wearing his coat, wearing his trousers underneath, I wager. She comes riding into town on his horse, clinging to him like a lover, and expects me to welcome her back? Shame washed over Eliza, hot and suffocating. She felt the eyes of the men on her, judging, stripping her, imagining the things Charles was implying. She wanted to shrink. She wanted to apologize. It was the old pattern, the groove worn deep in her soul by 3 years of marriage. But then she felt a hand on the small of her back. It was not a grab. It was a touch of support, warm and steady. Jesse did not step in front of her. He stood beside her. He was letting her fight, but letting her know she was not alone. She remembered the fire. She remembered the soup spoon held to her lips. She remembered the man who had slept on the floor to preserve her honor. Eliza's heart straightened her spine. She lifted her chin. She looked Charles in the eye, and for the first time, she saw him not as a monster, but as a small, pathetic man. "You are a liar. Charles," she said. Her voice rang out, clear and steady. "You did not ride for help. You lost your money gambling. You found the flower money I had saved. You hit me." She pulled up the sleeve of the coat. She rolled up the sleeve of her dress. The bruises were fading to a sickly yellow, but the shape of the fingers was still distinct on her pale skin. She held her arm out for the room to see. "He hit me," she repeated, turning to the men in the armchairs. "And then he dragged me out into the storm. He told me to find my own way. He got on his horse and he left me. He left me to freeze because he was too much of a coward to look at me after he struck me." Charles's face flushed a deep, ugly red. "That is a lie. She is mad. The cold has turned her brain. I tried to get her to come with me. She refused. She ran off." He turned on Jesse, seeing the danger in Eliza's truth. "You put these ideas in her head," Charles screamed. "You savage! You stole her! You found her confused and you took advantage of her. You twisted her mind against her lawful husband. I carried her," Jesse said, his voice deadly calm. "I carried her because she couldn't walk, because you threw her away." Charles lunged for the moral high ground, grabbing at the prejudices of the town like weapons. "You hear him?" Charles shouted to the room. "He admits he had her. A man who scouted for the army, a man who has killed more people than the pox. We know about you, Cole. We know you turned on your own mother's people, and we know you don't belong with ours. You are a violent dog, and you have dragged my wife down into the dirt with you." The atmosphere in the room shifted. It thickened. The sympathy that might have existed for Eliza was curdling under the weight of Charles's accusations. To the men of Red Rock, Charles was one of them. He was a white man, a husband, a settler. Jesse was the other. He was the dark unknown. Mr. Henderson, who had followed them from the store, spoke up from the doorway. "My boy died on the Bozeman Trail," he said, his voice hard. "Fighting Indians. I don't like the look of this. Cole, a man taking another man's wife." "I took no one," Jesse said, his hand hovering near his revolver, though he did not draw. "I saved a life." Charles saw the crowd turning. He pressed his advantage. "He has shamed her," Charles yelled. "He has ruined her reputation. No decent woman would spend 3 nights alone with a half-breed buck unless she was forced, or unless she was loose." Jesse took a step forward. The floorboards creaked. The threat radiating from him was palpable. "Careful," Jesse said. Violence hung in the air. A spark, waiting for dry grass. "Enough." The shout came from the street. Marshal Tom Davis pushed his way through the crowd that had gathered at the door. He was a heavy man with a walrus mustache and weary eyes. He looked at Charles, then at Eliza, and finally at Jesse. "Marshal." "Arrest him," Charles demanded. "He kidnapped my wife. He saved my life," Eliza countered, her voice breaking. Davis held up a hand. "Quiet, all of you." He looked at Jesse with a mixture of respect and wariness. "Jesse, keep your hand away from that iron. I'm just standing here." "Marshal," Jesse said. Davis looked at Eliza. "Ma'am, you look like you have been through hell. I have—" "Marshal, my husband put me there." Charles sputtered. She is lying. She is protecting him because he has seduced her. Davis rubbed his face with a gloved hand. I am not having a shooting war in the boarding house lobby. This ain't the place. He looked around at the gathering crowd. The mood was ugly. Men were muttering. The accusations of adultery and miscegenation were potent fuel. We are going to sort this out, Davis said. But we are going to do it proper. Over at the saloon, in the back room. The saloon? Eliza asked, horrified. It is the only room big enough for this many years, Davis said grimly. And it seems the whole town wants to have a say. Marshal, Charles protested. This is a matter for a husband to correct. It is a matter for the law when you start shouting about kidnapping and attempted murder. Davis snapped. Now move, all of you. The procession to the saloon was a gauntlet. Eliza walked with her head high, but inside she was trembling. She felt the eyes of the women watching from the windows. She heard the whispers. Ruined, whore, savage. They entered the Golden Nugget Saloon. The bartender stopped wiping the bar. The piano player fell silent. Marshal Davis led them into the back room, a space usually reserved for high-stakes poker games. It smelled of stale cigar smoke, spilled beer, and aggressive masculinity. Eliza sat in a wooden chair. Jesse stood behind her, his back to the wall, his eyes scanning the room, marking every exit, every weapon, every pair of hands. Charles stood on the other side of the room, surrounded by a knot of supporters, men who owed him money, or men who simply hated Jesse Cole on principle. Marshal Davis stood at the head of the table. All right, we are going to hear this, and if anyone reaches for a gun, I will shoot them myself. Charles started immediately. He was smooth, articulate, the injured party. He painted a picture of a loving marriage strained by the harsh frontier. He spoke of his desperate ride for help, his agony when he returned to find the cabin empty. He spoke of Jesse as a predator, a wolf who had found a lost lamb and devoured her innocence. He makes a good story, doesn't he? Jesse said softly, his voice cutting through Charles's rhetoric. Eliza looked at Jesse. He was watching the crowd. He saw what she did not. He saw the way the men were nodding. They wanted to believe Charles. To believe Eliza meant admitting that a white man could be a monster, and that a mixed-blood scout could be a hero. It overturned the natural order of their world. Eliza stood up. The chair scraped against the floor. She looked at the faces of her neighbors, the baker, the blacksmith, the men she had sold eggs to. You know him, she said, pointing at Charles. You know he drinks, you know he gambles, you know he loses. And she turned to Mr. Henderson. You sold him the flour I bought. Mr. Henderson. You remember? I paid in dimes. Dimes I hid in the sugar jar. Henderson shifted his feet, looking down. And you, Mrs. Miller, Eliza said, spotting the seamstress in the doorway. You saw the bruise on my cheek last July. You asked me if I walked into a door. I lied then. I am not lying now. She took a deep breath. He left me. The wind was blowing 60 miles an hour. He threw me in the snow. He didn't ride for help. He rode to save his own skin. Charles stepped forward, his face twisted. She is trying to save her lover. Can't you see? She has been corrupted. He looked at Jesse. Tell them, Cole. Tell them what you did to her in that cabin for 3 nights. Tell them how you took your payment for saving her. Jesse pushed off the wall. He walked into the center of the room. He towered over Charles. I sat on the floor. Jesse said, I slept on the wood. I fed her soup. I kept the fire. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the men who hated him. I treated her with more honor in 3 days than this man has in 3 years. A murmur went through the crowd. Some were swaying. Jesse's quiet dignity was a powerful thing. But then a voice called out from the back. It was a rancher named Grady, a man known for his hatred of the tribes. A buck is a buck, Grady spat. You can put a coat on a wolf, but it still bites. My brother died at Fetterman because of scouts like you leading them into traps. I say he stole her. I say he forced her. And I say we don't let him ride out of here laughing at us. The mood in the room snapped. It turned from a hearing into a hunt. Charles smiled. It was a small, tight smile of victory. He saw the violence rising, and he welcomed it. It was his shield. If Jesse died, the truth died with him. "He is dangerous," Charles shouted. "Marshal, he is armed. He is threatening the town." Jesse's hand dropped to his hip. He didn't draw, but the movement was instinctual. Marshal Davis looked panicked. He saw the control slipping away. "Now hold on," Davis shouted, but the crowd was pressing in. The old hatreds, the fear of the winter, the boredom of the long months, it all focused on the man in the center of the room. Eliza looked at Jesse. He wasn't looking at Charles anymore. He was looking at her. His eyes were sad, and they were apologizing. He had promised to walk with her. He had promised to stand by her. But she realized now that he had known all along how this would end. He had known that a man like him could not stand against a man like Charles in a town like this without blood being spilled. Jesse leaned close to her, his voice a whisper that only she could hear. "Stay behind me." "Eliza?" "No," she whispered back, grabbing his sleeve. "Jesse, don't. I have to," he said. "They won't let us walk out." He looked at Charles. The air in the room was suffocating, thick with smoke and hate. "You want to fight? Hard?" Jesse asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Or do you just want your friends to do it for you?" Charles's face went purple. "I will see you hanged. Cole!" He reached for the pistol tucked into his belt. "No!" Eliza screamed. The room exploded into motion. The judgment was over. The violence had begun. And in the smoky haze of the saloon, Eliza realized with a sickening clarity that the blizzard had been the safe place. And this room full of people and laws and civilization was where the real storm was waiting. The air in the back room of the Golden Nugget Saloon was so thick with tension it felt like a physical weight, heavy enough to crush the breath out of a man. The shouting had died down into a low, ugly murmur, the sound of a hive disturbed. Charles Hart stood by the poker table, his face a mottled map of rage and humiliation. He had lost the crowd. He had lost the narrative he had so carefully constructed of the grieving husband and the predatory scout. In the eyes of the men of Red Rock, he was no longer a victim. He was a man who had let another man save his wife, and that was a sin the frontier did not forgive. "You are lying!" Charles screamed, his voice cracking. The sound was desperate, shrill against the low rumble of the saloon. "You have bewitched them. You have turned my own wife into a whore to save your neck." Eliza stood her ground. She was trembling, but her chin was lifted, her eyes dry and hard as flint. "I am telling the truth. Charles," she said, "for the first time in 3 years, I am telling the truth." Charles lunged. It was not a calculated move. It was a spasm of pure, impotent fury. He crossed the few feet between them and grabbed Eliza by the upper arm. His fingers dug into the flesh through the sleeve of the coat, finding the very spot where the old bruises were fading. He shook her, his teeth bared in a snarl. "You will recant," he hissed, his face inches from hers, spitting the words. "You will tell them he forced you. You will tell them," Eliza gasped, the pain sharp and sudden. But before she could pull away, the air in the room shifted. Jesse Cole moved. He did not draw his weapon. He did not shout. He stepped into the space between husband and wife with the fluidity of water. He clamped his left hand over Charles's wrist, the one gripping Eliza, and squeezed. It was the grip of a man who shoed horses and branded cattle. Charles's eyes went wide as the pressure ground his bones together. Jesse shoved. He didn't strike. He simply applied force. A hard, decisive push to the chest that sent Charles staggering backward. Charles's boots skidded on the sawdust floor. He flailed, crashing into a small round table, sending a deck of cards and a half-empty bottle of whiskey clattering to the floor. "Get your hands off her," Jesse said. His voice was not loud, but it carried to every corner of the room. It was the voice of a man who was done talking. The room erupted. "That is enough," shouted a man from the back. "He just struck a white man. He was defending the lady," another voice countered. "See, he is a savage. He knows nothing but violence." Grady, the rancher who hated Jesse, yelled, stepping forward with his hand near his hip. Marshal Davis slammed his hand on the table. "Order. I will have order in this room or I will pistol whip the lot of you." Charles scrambled to his feet. He was panting, his hair falling over his forehead, his eyes darting around the room. He saw the looks on the faces of the men. He saw the disgust. He saw the judgment. He realized, with a terrifying clarity, that he was ruined. He would never sell another sack of flour in this town. He would never sit at the high-stakes table again. He was the man who beat his wife and let a half-breed save her. His gaze fell on the table to his right. There, resting on a pile of newspapers, was a heavy dragoon pistol that belonged to one of the cattlemen. The room went still. It was the kind of silence that happens before a thunderclap. Eliza saw his eyes fix on the gun. "Charles." "No," she whispered. Jesse saw it too. He did not reach for his own gun. He held his empty hands out, palms open, waist high. He took a slow step forward, placing himself squarely between Charles and Eliza. "Don't do it." "Hart," Jesse said. His voice was low, strangely gentle. "Do not touch that iron. There is no coming back from that." "You ruined me," Charles whispered. His hand hovered over the pistol grip. "You took everything. I took nothing that wasn't already lost." Jesse said, "Walk away." "Charles, just walk out the door. Nobody has to die here today." For a second, it seemed as if Charles might listen. His hand trembled. He looked at the door, but then he looked at Eliza. She was looking at Jesse, and in her eyes, Charles saw something he had never seen in 3 years of marriage. Respect, safety, love. It broke him. "I will not be laughed at." Charles screamed. He grabbed the pistol. It was heavy, clumsy in his merchant's hands. He swung it up, blind with tears and rage, not aiming, just wanting to destroy the source of his shame. "Jesse!" Eliza screamed. The explosion was deafening in the small room. The gun bucked in Charles's hand. The bullet went wide, smashing into the back of a wooden chair inches from Eliza's shoulder, sending a shower of splinters into her hair. Jesse's reaction was not a choice. It was a reflex honed by 10 years of surviving encounters that lasted fractions of a second. His hand blurred. The Colt Navy appeared as if by magic. He did not want to kill. He aimed low. For the shoulder, for the arm, to stop the threat. But the room was chaos. Men were diving for cover. Charles was stumbling forward as he fired, off balance from the recoil. Jesse pulled the trigger. The shot was a dry crack, sharper than the boom of the dragoon pistol. Charles jerked backward as if he had been kicked by a mule. The bullet did not hit his shoulder. It caught him square in the chest, just to the left of the sternum. He stood there for a heartbeat, a look of profound confusion on his face. He looked down at his shirt. A dark, wet bloom was spreading rapidly across the white cotton. He looked up at Eliza. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to accuse her one last time, perhaps to apologize. But no sound came out. He collapsed. He hit the floor hard, the pistol clattering from his hand. He twitched once, and then he was still. The silence that followed was absolute. The smoke from the 2 gunshots hung in the air, a blue-gray haze that stung the eyes. Eliza stood frozen. She could not breathe. She stared at the body of her husband. He looked smaller in death, like a pile of empty clothes. She felt a numbness spreading through her limbs, a cold that was deeper than the blizzard. Jesse stood over the body. He had not holstered his gun. He held it down at his side, the barrel smoking. His face was a mask of tragedy. He did not look like a victor. He looked like a man who had just lost something precious. Marshal Davis was the first to move. He walked over to Charles, knelt, and pressed 2 fingers to his neck. He waited, then shook his head. "He is dead," Davis said. He stood up and looked at Jesse. "Jesse Cole, holster your weapon." Jesse did so slowly, the click of the metal loud in the quiet room. He looked at Eliza. He didn't say a word. He couldn't. Davis looked around the room. "I saw it," the bartender said from the corner, his voice shaking. Hart went for the gun. "He fired first. I saw it too," the blacksmith said. "Cole tried to talk him down." Davis nodded. He looked at Jesse. "It was self-defense," Davis said. "There is no doubt about that. He fired on an unarmed woman and he fired on you. You had the right." He paused, looking at the body on the floor. But this is a bad business. Jesse, a bad business. You killed a white man in a room full of his friends. The law says you are free. But this town has a long memory. I know, Jesse said. His voice was raspy. Eliza walked over to him. She did not look at Charles. She looked at Jesse. She saw the devastation in his eyes. He had sworn to himself he would not bring violence into her life. And here it was, pooling on the floorboards. She reached out and took his hand. His fingers were cold. "Thank you," she whispered. The words were inadequate. They were tiny things against the enormity of what had just happened. But she meant them. He had saved her from the snow, and he had saved her from the bullet. Jesse looked at her, and the pain in his expression frightened her. He gently pulled his hand away. "I am sorry, Eliza," he said. He turned and walked out of the back room, through the silent saloon, and out into the muddy street. The days that followed were a blur of gray dampness. The town of Red Rock did not know what to do with Eliza Hart. She was a widow, made so by the hand of the man who had rescued her. The gossip was a quiet, steady hum, like telegraph wires in the wind. Some said she had planned it. Some said she was a victim of two violent men. Others, the women mostly, looked at her with a new, guarded respect. She had survived the whiteout, and she had stood up to Charles Hart. She was not the same woman who had bought flour in dimes. Eliza buried Charles on a Tuesday. It was a simple service on the hill overlooking the town. The ground was half-frozen mud. There were few mourners. Mr. Henderson, the landlady, the marshal. Jesse was not there. Eliza stood by the grave and felt a grief that was complicated and jagged. She did not cry for the man in the box. She cried for the girl she had been in Ohio, the girl who had believed that love was ribbons and poetry. She cried for the 3 years of her life that had been eaten by fear. She cried because she was free, and freedom felt terrifyingly empty. She stayed in the boarding house, paying her way by mending sheets and washing dishes. She waited. She knew Jesse was still in town. He was staying at the livery stable, sleeping in the loft. He had been fired from the Circle T. The rancher didn't want a killer on the payroll, regardless of the law's ruling. On the 4th day, Silas the blacksmith told her that Jesse was saddling up. He was leaving. Eliza dropped the dishcloth. She didn't put on a bonnet. She grabbed her shawl, the same shawl she had worn in the cabin, and ran. She found him at the edge of town, where the muddy street gave way to the open prairie. The snow was almost gone now, leaving behind patches of pale, yellow-green grass that spoke of the coming spring. The sky was a vast, bruised purple, the sun setting behind the mountains. Jesse was mounted on the big bay gelding. His saddlebags were packed full. He was looking west, toward the territories that were still wild, toward the places where a man could disappear. Jesse! He reined the horse in and turned. When he saw her running toward him, his face tightened. He looked like a man who was seeing a ghost. Eliza stopped near the horse's flank, breathless, her hem heavy with mud. "You were going to leave," she said, without a word. "It is better this way," Jesse said. He did not look down at her. He stared at the horizon. "Better for who?" she demanded. "For you," he said. His voice was rough. "Look at me, Eliza. Look at what I bring. Violence follows me like a shadow. I tried to keep you safe, and I ended up putting a bullet in your husband. You are a widow now because of me. I am a widow because Charles was a fool and a coward," Eliza cried. "You didn't kill him, Jesse. His own hate killed him. You just stopped him from taking me with him." Jesse looked down at her then. The misery in his eyes broke her heart. "I am a half-breed scout with blood on my hands. Eliza, you are a lady. The town, they will never let you forget what happened. If I stay, I am a stain on you. If I go, maybe you can find a life. Go back east. Find a man who doesn't sleep with a gun under his pillow." Eliza stepped closer to the horse. She reached up and grabbed the bridle. The horse shifted, but she held firm. "I don't want a man from the east," she said. "I had one. He left me to freeze." She looked up at him, the wind whipping her hair across her face. "You think you are darkness. Jesse, you think you are nothing but scars and war. But you are the only man who ever saw me. You are the one who carried me. You are the one who warmed me. You are the one who stood in front of a gun for me." She took a breath, her voice trembling. "I love you." Jesse flinched as if she had struck him. He shook his head. "Eliza, don't. You are grateful. That is all. It is not gratitude," she shouted. "I know the difference. I love you, not because you saved me, but because of who you were in that cabin. Because you are gentle when you don't have to be. Because you are honorable when no one is watching." She let go of the bridle and stepped back, spreading her hands. "If you want to ride away, Jesse Cole, you ride away. But do not do it for me. Do not tell yourself you are saving me. Because if you leave me here, you are leaving me in the cold just as surely as Charles did." The silence stretched between them. The wind rustled the dead grass. The horse stamped a hoof. Jesse sat there, a statue carved from granite and regret. He looked at the empty horizon, the safe, lonely path he had chosen. Then he looked at the woman standing in the mud, small and fierce and broken and beautiful. He saw her bruises. He saw her courage. He saw a mirror of his own wounded soul. He let out a long, shuddering breath. He swung his leg over the saddle and dropped to the ground. He stood before her, towering and hesitant. "I have nothing." "Eliza," he said quietly, "I have a horse, a gun, and $40. I have a name that people spit on." Eliza took a step forward. "I have 2 hands," she said. "I have a strong back, and I have you." She reached out and took his hand. It was the hand that had pulled the trigger, but she did not fear it. She interlaced her fingers with his. "We can go to the High Valley," she said, "the one you told me about. We can build a cabin, a real one." Jesse looked at their joined hands. He looked at her face, illuminated by the dying light. He felt the walls of his self-imposed prison crumbling. "I'm afraid I will hurt you," he confessed, his voice a whisper, "that the war inside me will spill out." Eliza reached up and touched his cheek, her thumb tracing the scar near his eye. "Then we will fight it together," she said. "Love isn't pretending the past didn't happen. Jesse, it is choosing to walk forward anyway." Jesse closed his eyes and leaned into her touch. He surrendered. "Okay," he breathed. "Okay." He opened his eyes and pulled her to him. This time, there was no hesitation. He kissed her, not with the desperate hunger of the cabin, but with a deep, deliberate claim. It was a kiss that tasted of the wind and the earth and the promise of hard work. It was a kiss that said, "I am here." They stood there in the twilight, 2 shipwrecked souls who had found a raft. The wind was cold, but the heat between them was enough to hold it back. 18 months later, the wind howled around the corners of the cabin, a familiar, predatory sound. It was late December, 1880. The snow was falling in heavy, wet sheets, burying the High Valley in silence. Inside, the cabin was warm. It was not the drafty shack of Charles's homestead, nor the cramped line cabin of the blizzard. It was a home. The walls were thick pine logs, chinked tight with mud and moss. The floor was split planking, smooth and swept clean. A heavy iron stove radiated heat in the corner, and a fire crackled cheerfully in the stone hearth. Jesse sat in a rocking chair he had built himself, whittling a piece of cedar. He was older, the gray at his temples more pronounced, but the tension that had once defined his posture was gone. He looked like a man who belonged where he was. Eliza sat on the rug near the fire, mending a pair of wool socks. She paused, listening to the wind. "It sounds like the old storm," she said. Jesse stopped whittling. He looked at the window, where the frost was painting ferns on the glass. "It does," he agreed, "but the woodpile is high, and the roof is solid." He looked down at her. His eyes were soft. The shadows of the war pushed back to the far corners of his mind. Eliza put down her mending. She moved to his chair, kneeling beside him. She rested her head on his knee. His hand came down automatically to stroke her hair. "We did it," she whispered. "We survived." Jesse looked around the room. He saw the rifle hanging on the wall, dusty now, used only for hunting venison. He saw the dried herbs hanging from the rafters. He saw the life they had carved out of the rock and the ice. It hadn't been easy. The first winter was lean. The neighbors were distant, but they had done it. He looked at the woman who had saved him just as much as he had saved her. "We did," he said. He leaned down and kissed the top of her head. "Let it snow," he said. "We have the fire." Eliza smiled, closing her eyes. The Wild West was still harsh outside their door. The wolves still howled, and the world was still full of judgment. But in the circle of light they had made, there was warmth, there was justice, and there was a love that had walked through the ice and come out the other side, burning brighter than before. Thank you deeply for listening to this story of Eliza and Jesse. Writing the American West is a passion of mine, trying to capture not just the gunfights, but the quiet, desperate resilience of the people who lived under that vast, indifferent sky. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below telling me where you are listening from in the world. It is always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this journey into the blizzard and the human heart, please consider subscribing to From Wild West. I have many more stories to tell, of outlaws, lawmen, and the ordinary people who did extraordinary things to survive. Please share your thoughts on the ending in English. Did Jesse and Eliza find the peace they deserved? I look forward to reading your words. Until the next campfire, your storyteller.